a field survival guide for network standards wonks. I was told that wonk might not be a nice word, so I've changed it to folks. Hopefully that makes everyone a little bit happier, a little bit more comfortable with the topic. But this is a rough outline of the talk. I'm going to give you a little bit of background, a little bit more about myself, where I'm coming from, and how I think about this stuff. And then I'm going to jump right into the thesis of this talk, which is why I've personally been pushing the ONF to go in this direction for so long, why I think it's the right thing for the ONF, and why I hope that you guys will think it's the right thing for the ONF, which is I really do believe that open source actually beats open standards. And what I mean by beats is really we'll have more impact, we'll move faster, and we'll ultimately run the course over time and be the most desirable thing. And then, assuming I can convince you with that, or assuming you guys don't have pitchforks and torches and come after me, I'll go through what the implications are for people who may not have an open source background, people who want to work at a company that still makes money, and how you might do that in the open source world. Some of the legal stuff that you may want to know if you don't have an open source background, some of the projects that exist in this space already, and it's actually, the list is far too long to get into. I'm just going to get into some of either my favorites, the big ones, or some combination thereof. A little bit of where to get started, and last I'll end with some conclusions and hopefully leave some time for questions and answers. So, yes, my job is CTO at Big Switch Networks. This talk has nothing to do with Big Switch Networks. No one has seen it at Big Switch. These are my own thoughts. Maybe more importantly, I try to write a lot of open source software. Maybe more accurately, given my current title, I'm involved with a lot of open source software these days. Projects that people might know me for. How many people know about the Flowvisor? So I wrote that. I was pretty happy about that back in the days where we used to write code. I wrote Cbench. I was involved with Loxy, OFTest, OFFlops. I'm still involved in the Indigo OpenFlow project. I'm still very much involved in the Floodlight project. I have a new project right now, Open Network Linux. Who's heard of this one? All right. And no one has heard of my Slurpee project, right? This is from my grad school days. All right. It's worth checking out. But all right, enough about me. Short story, I've been involved in a bunch of open source projects. But maybe more importantly than this, and Dan Pitt will tell you, I've been advocating for open source since before the ONF existed. Before this was publicly announced, I have been that annoying little voice in the back of his head going, hey, are you sure that we should be doing the standards thing? Are you sure we should be doing more of this open source thing? And I really give Dan a lot of credit, and the board of the ONF a lot of credit, that they really are trying to steer the ship in a different direction. And I think this is great. And you can think in a lot of ways that this talk has been many years in coming. Or at least I think it is. So that said, there's a bunch of caveats. Everybody knows what I mean when I say the asbestos undergarments are on? I've got one person. All right, so let me tell you the assumptions I'm making about this talk and kind of who you are. So I believe that most of the people in this group have a fair bit of standards development experience. And that's good, and that's really what the ONF has really historically been about. And more so, I feel like probably few of you, and there are definitely some notable exceptions, really have a strong open source developer background. And the result is, honestly, what I'm going to have to say up here is just a tough sell. I'm really trying to help the ONF and the ONF's members really go through a process of changing the direction of the ship. And I realize that this is a tough sell. And so I'm intentionally making this talk controversial. I'm intentionally going to say things that might be a little bit off. But I'm doing this mostly because I believe that you have to push the ship really hard to make it change a little bit. And I kind of apologize for that in advance. Also, I have a bunch of really good excuses. There was actually a very good chance I wasn't going to show up here. I was traveling internationally for the last 2 weeks. I came back and had the worst illness I've had in 10 years a couple days ago. I lost 9 pounds. I really only made the call that I was going to show up here late last night. But you know what? Those are all excuses, and everybody who's ever been in the position I'm in right now knows that that's an occupational hazard. The fact that I haven't slept last night just does make this talk more fun. So Even then, looking over what I've written here, I may have gone too far. So I'm intentionally going to leave some time towards the end to answer some questions and get some feedback from people. And if your feedback is, say, more targeted and you want to give that to me directly, I'm happy to take that as well. So with that in mind, let's jump into the actual talk. So what is this thesis that I'm talking about? How could it be that open source beats open standards? And let me just judge the audience a little bit here. By a show of hands, how many people already believe that this is true? How many people don't need me to convince them of this? All right, so this is about what I was hoping. I have no idea what I would have done if everybody raised their hand. I mean, I would have been totally beside myself. All right, so good. I can move forward with the rest of the talk. So I actually asked a lot of people this question from a more traditional standards background. Do you think that open source is actually more important than open standards? The look I got in most people's face was a lot like this. There was just shock and horror and this deep, deep gushing anguish. And I was really looking for some sort of deep cultural meme to express this, but I understand the ONF is a very multicultural background, so I had to go way back to find something that I thought could hit across all sorts of culture barriers and backgrounds. And it really did hit the spot for me. It's like, no, this can't be true. That's impossible. Everybody knows that open standards are the foundation of all of modern networking. This is the most, we are taught this from, when you're a little kid in the cradle and you got your little TCP/IP illustrated in one hand and your little C compile in the other, you were taught that open standards are how the internet runs. Right? That's what everyone's taught. But I'm here to tell you that you need to search your feelings, listen to what I'm saying, and start to understand what I'm saying is true. That there is actually a really important role for open source in the internet, and if you go back historically, you actually find that it's one of the dominant roles. And it's my claim, and I'm hoping to try to convince you today, that it's actually something we need to go back to. Also, there's UTSL, which is an old expression in the open source world. It's kind of like RTFM, but for source code, but stands for use the source, Luke. Something else to think about. So, on to something a little bit more serious. Where would the internet be without open source, right? So I picked kind of 3 of my favorite open source projects that I thought of as really kind of foundational for the internet. There's the entire BSD code base, but particularly the TCP stack from it. The TCP stack from the BSD code base got copied, forked, or the algorithms got used and reused into almost all of the major code bases at some point in time. Now, if you look at something like the Linux kernel, okay, yeah, things have been changed so much over time, you don't really see the bits there. But if you don't believe me, track some of the epidemiology of some of the big denial of service attacks, like ping of death or landmine or things like that, when all of a sudden the entire internet goes, oh, wait, we're all vulnerable to the same thing. How did that happen? Oh, it's because we all started with the same code, that's how. And it's kind of cool to see that the RFC for this came out roughly the same time as the code did, give or take a year or so. And same thing with SendMail. If folks are familiar with SMTP, the Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, the SendMail implementation of that has existed for a really long time and is actually still a very dominant, if you connect to a random port 25 on the internet, the odds are pretty good it's running SendMail. And don't even get me started on DNS bind, now run by the ISE people. This is again a very dominant piece of open source software. It runs all of the DNS, I should say all the DNS around the world. There's lots of, and I'm not trying to say that there are not commercial companies that do better jobs. I'm not trying to say that there isn't a good world for improvement on top of these things. I'm just saying that there are some foundational pieces of open source software that helped really define the internet. And looking at at least these 3 data points, I claim that there's a pattern. And that there's a pattern that's worth at least noting and thinking about, how does this affect us? And the first thing in the pattern is, it looks like, for some things, when the open source comes out near the standards, that is, roughly after a year or 2, because, it takes a couple of time to write some of this code and get it working, there's actually some pretty nice benefits, which is, over time, you get a small number of dominant open source implementations. Everybody's on board that OSS is open source software.
they kind of emerge over time. And once you've got some good quality open source available, you get some nice properties, which is interoperability is pretty trivial. If you want to understand if you're interoperable, you download it and you test it. Critical things like implementation quirks, which can sync in an implementation if you don't get the quirks right, because not everything's always standardized. That's pretty easy to test because you look at the code. And it also becomes less important that a standard is super precise if there's at least a good reference implementation, either de facto, usually more de facto than otherwise. Another nice thing to see is, if you look at least the three examples that I found, it's nice to see that open source implementations actually do expand to adopt new features over time. I mean, there's more TCP congestion control implementations that I can shake a stick at, send mail off, DNSSEC. There's all sorts of things get pulled into these open source code bases. So it's not like they're dead. It's not like they're not evolving. And they're able to achieve this property that I'll explain in the next slide, which I call agility without vendor lock-in. And that's actually pretty important. And a lot of that comes back to, really it's a shift from the importance away from the standards body to the actual code. Now this is kind of high level and hand wavy, but bear with me for a couple slides. The result of, at least with these three cases, is something which I call the actually really important thing, which is, at least for these three pieces of code, we get this property where people can code and test and deploy, measure the result for a while, and if they decide it's actually useful, then standardize. And once you can do this, my claim is, and this is one of the main points of the talk, this is actually how you get agility. By being able to do some development, do some experimentation, to do some deployments, all in open source, in a code base that everybody kind of knows and understands and is kind of well known. And only once you actually figure out what's good for the world, standardize, then you actually get some really fast, you get people working in parallel, you get fast adoption, you get fast understanding because people can replicate results. We can call it like science or something crazy like that. It's pretty interesting. So one of the IT groups that I personally follow is the TCP mine and maintenance groups, TCPM. And nobody waits to talk to the TCPM group before modifying TCP. Everybody modifies it every 5 ways to Sunday. But once they figure out something good or they want somebody's feedback on it, then they talk to the maintenance group to figure out, is this something that's useful for the community at large? Is this something people have tried before and realize is a bad idea? Is this something that maybe changes the way people look at things? And so it's not that the standards groups aren't useful. They're in fact incredibly useful. It's where the experts get around to gather and talk about things. But they're the thing that comes after the experimentation. And critically, at least in my mind, this prevents you from standardizing the things that you don't want to standard, which, things that aren't terribly useful. In other words, we start to avoid standardization bloat. And I would actually claim, and hopefully people will argue with me, but after the talk, let me get through all my crazy slides first, that this is the goal that we want for the networking. Whether or not you believe this actually applies to the projects that I was talking about, I claim this is the goal we want for networking. We want to be able to do some coding, some testing, and some deployment, figure out what works, and once we know what works and what doesn't, standardize on it. And then this is so that everybody can get this thing called agility. And I don't know about you, but this is what all my customers are asking for. This is the thing that they want. So my claim is that this is the goal. So what's an example of where this didn't work on the internet? I mean, I'm sure we could all sit here and come up with our favorite example from 1985 of protocols that didn't have good open source implementations. But what's my favorite, maybe particularly useful for this group? Routing protocols. Beyond RIP, there were not a lot of routing protocols that had really good open source implementations up until pretty much recently. And so let's go through that same type of properties list as we did before. So historically, beyond RIP, there weren't really a lot of good quality routing open source protocols that pervaded through 30 years of time, like TCP did, like SendMail did, like DNS did. Those things just don't exist. And the net result is, instead of a small number of kind of long-tailed winners existing, we actually have a lot of different routing implementations. In fact, in most cases, we have multiple implementations per vendor. And the net result is interoperability is actually pretty hard. we get into these plug fests, we get to these expensive testing gear, and I'm not saying that the testing is bad, but at the end of the day, the engineers are not going to tell you that n-squared testing is a useful thing. It also takes time to get new features in because typically they have to go through standards bodies. And the net result, and this may not be everybody's favorite point, but I believe it's pretty self-evident, is there's not as much agility in the network as we'd like. And there's fairly strong vendor lock-in. And a lot of this, I think, ties back to legitimate concerns that customers have about interoperability. And that typically steers people towards single vendor solutions. And the net result of all of this is the bottom line, which is, at least for routing, and I would argue in general for things that don't have solid open source bases, the importance of the standard body is actually heightened relative to things that have softer open source bases. And so, let's try to be fair here. Maybe there's something different about routing, something that makes it special, something that makes it harder. Certainly a lot of companies make a lot of money off of routing, and a lot of them are in this room, so I don't want to be unfair here if I don't have to be. But so, routing requires tightly coupled distributed algorithms. This is a hard thing to solve. This is a legitimately hard problem. But is it really harder than all the different open source distributed database algorithms that have lower latency guarantees and higher fault tolerance issues? Is it more distributed than TCP? What about more inter-vendor interoperability? If you're a router on the internet, you might have to talk to everyone. That's a hard problem. It's a legitimately hard problem. But is it really harder than a mail server that has to talk to potentially even more, or a DNS server that, there's just an order of magnitude more of these boxes on the network. This doesn't seem to be that different of a problem to me. What about scale? Probably no one in this room cares, but I spent my dissertation doing it, so I'll tell you anyways. One of the results of my dissertation work was there's on the order of about 100,000 routers in the world. And maybe I'm wrong by a little bit, but not by a lot. So call it on that order. And so can you deal with 100,000 nodes in your distributed system? Well, that's not more than TCP has to deal with, or DNS, maybe an SMTP. So are these all really fundamentally different problems? So my claim is the thing that actually makes routing different, the thing that makes routing harder, is the closed hardware. That the companies that develop the routing protocols have historically been the companies that have developed the routing hardware. And because of the tight coupling between those two, that's actually why there's been no good open source routing hardware until recently. And so I claim, and I've met the Quagga people, they're good people, I don't think they disagree with this statement. I haven't met the Zorp people, probably also good people, that Quagga, Zorp, or similar open source routing stacks, I claim that those people would not claim that those are the best routing stacks in the world. That's not because they can't be, it's not because there's something inherent about it, it's just, you got to start somewhere and you got to try to build up to the people who've been building routing stacks their whole lives, and very, I think, reasonably could argue that they have better routing stacks. But people are trying to continue to improve these things. There's increasingly more organization around this, more people contributing funds towards it, commercial software going behind this, all trying to improve the quality of open source routing. And I claim that this correlates with two things. One is the increased performance behind software routers. So if you take an x86 and hook up DPDK or something to it, you can actually get some pretty good speeds out of that. Up to 200 gigabits if you believe some of the benchmarks I've seen. Conversely, there are more and more companies producing open hardware, or on the lines of merchant silicon, who will at least license out access to the low-level hardware such that it's interesting to, for example, a company like mine to look at open source routing software. It's actually becoming possible to access the hardware in a way that makes open source a relevant thing for routing. And so my claim is that it's actually closed hardware that's affecting whether there's open source for routing or not. And more so, I claim that as networking hardware becomes more open, through some of the dimensions I'm talking about, either by going with an x86 approach or going through some sort of programmable basis, or even more merchant silicon or things like that, that routing will go even more and more to open source. And so, You might say, whatever, I'm eating my breakfast, I'm in the ONF, where the hell is Rob going with this? So what does this mean to the ONF? And so maybe I've taken my time getting here, but I think this is a critical point. If you believe what I'm saying, that open source routing software is really hasn't existed because there's been closed hardware, wouldn't it be really nice if there was some sort of thing that we could decouple the routing logic from the hardware? So, at least the routing open source software grow on its own and we could solve the rest of it later. Something that decoupled the control plane from the data plane. Yeah, I mean, and it would be really cool if it wasn't just about layer 3. If it did something useful for layer 2 and layer 4 and maybe some optical stuff and maybe wireless or something like that. Wouldn't that be really interesting? Because then we could actually try an experiment and see, is Rob right? If we had some sort of layer that decoupled routing software from the underlying hardware, would an open source ecosystem exist? And if we had this magical thing, would we be at our goal? Would we actually get the agility that I was talking about before? And so, I wave my magic wand, movie lights appear, and we have the great and powerful OpenFlow. Everybody knows about OpenFlow. We've been working on this for a while now, and we don't quite have the agility that I think we were all led to believe that we wanted out of OpenFlow. And I mean, does anyone really disagree with this passionately? I mean, grab me afterwards. I'm kind of on a roll here, so the question is why? And I've been thinking about this for a long time, and my tough answer to this question is I think we've actually recreated the problem we've been trying to solve. Which is to say, in an effort to increase agility and to decrease dependence on standards bodies, which that's why I signed up onto the ONF, we've actually created a new standards body that has even more importance for net decrease in agility. And I think this comes right back to the open source software. I really think this is, and apologies if you guys have heard this quip before, it's my fault. I really think the ONF needs to move from PDF-defined networking to software-defined networking. We need to be the body that builds the software, not that builds the standard. And I'm really excited to see the steps that the board has taken to actually move towards this, because I think this is the problem. If we want the agility of software, we need to not do it from a standards perspective. And so, if you only take one thing from this talk, I want you to take this slide from this talk. So, if you didn't follow that crazy chain of logic, I apologize. Let me try to recap it quickly. So the idea is many protocols had open source and open standards. And over time, my claim is the open source seems to have won, as evidenced by SendMail, by DNS bind, by the evolution of the BSD stack. The result was what I call is the desired goal, which is the ability to code, test, and deploy before you standardize. And that is how I define agility. And by counterexample, routing did not have the same agility. And my claim, still for you guys to think about, is because of the tight coupling to closed hardware. And if we had something like OpenFlow, we could reduce that tight coupling. But how do we stop ONF and OpenFlow from having that same problem, that tight coupling to the hardware? How do we stop it from being the standards body that actually causes the lack of agility? And the answer, cat's out of the bag in summary, is I think the ONF needs to move to open source, and I'm really happy to see it do that. So how many people totally disagree with me? I only got 2 hands. Oh, Jean, you're killing me. We'll come back. I'll let people heckle me in a second. But if that's all too long, didn't want to read it, or if you just disagree, think about it this way. Hopefully we can agree that networking is not agile enough. At least this is what all my customers tell me. So I take this as just ground truth. Maybe of a harder pill to swallow, but I'd like to say that I think we all agree the ONF historically has not been as agile as we wanted it to be. I think this is a safe statement. I mean, if nothing else, we can always try to do better. And I really do believe that open source is the great source of agility. It is the great answer to agility. It's the thing that lets people do massively distributed coding efforts. Have people ever heard the quip? It's really kind of the great rallying cry on open source. No matter where you work, the majority of smart people don't work with you. And so the idea is that with open source, you can actually leverage the majority of the smart people in the world. That is at least the hope. Now, obviously, there's organizational problems, or egos, personalities, and whatnot. It's not like all of that human nature goes away. But there really is a lot of evidence behind this. So whether you agree with what got us here or not, hopefully I can get you to agree that going towards open source is at least a viable thing. So given that, you can take all of that as you will. That is Rob waxing philosophic. The rest of this is hard, useful information that is reasonably without philosophy about, if you're interested in open source, how to take next steps behind that. So if you're sitting there saying, if you actually believe what I said, which might be a small set of you, and are not a developer by training, don't panic. There's actually, my claim is that smart, experienced folks are always useful no matter what skill set they have. Even if the world goes crazy and goes 100% open source tomorrow, it's either code or die, something like that. There's still going to be, everyone in this room has experience that is valuable, and I'm certainly not trying to take that away from anyone. There's huge uses in being able to refine and filter ideas, suggest new requirements, new directions, mentoring people. My God, documentation is a huge problem. And this is all extremely useful. That said, if you can do all of these things and code, that's even more useful. So I guess I would say that it is my belief that going forward, a PDF will not be the final delivery product of what I consider open networking. And so while all of these things are extremely useful and will remain so, know that at least my claim is the focus is changing. Now, how many people think that it's hard to make money with open source in the commercial world? Really? Y'all are just tired of raising your hand to my stupid questions. So a lot of people think it's hard to make money in the open source world. I'm going to give you 3 examples of how people make money in the open source world, just so you can go back to the companies who have paid for you to come here and tell them you at least thought of ways that you shouldn't be afraid of open source. So certainly the most common is to take your proprietary software and mix it with open source software. And everyone that I know who ships a commercial networking product does this. A lot of people build on FreeBSD. They build on an old fork of pre-FreeBSD. They build on Linux. They include libc. They include the libz, the compression utilities. They pull something from open source because why wouldn't you? It saves money. It saves time. It saves development effort. There's no use in rebuilding these things just to say you built it yourself. Unless you're Windows. I haven't quite figured that out. But, so, one thing that people find when they do this, though, is quite often you have to make little tweaks to the open source, something to make it work a little bit better for your software, or maybe you found a little bug, or maybe you found a little improvement that just helped your product together. And so if you find yourself in this world, quite often what people find, and you should run the analysis yourself because everybody has to convince themselves of this, is usually strictly from an economic standpoint, cheaper to put the work into upstreaming it to where you came from, to actually do the right thing from my perspective to contribute back to the community. Everybody has to go through this exercise themselves, but this has happened often enough that this is actually how a lot of open source gets contributed. I will say, and we've seen a lot of examples of this, and actually more so increasingly over time, your proprietary bit, you should be aware that you are actually vulnerable, at least in theory, to other companies open sourcing what's effectively an inferior product, but one that competes with you. I've seen numerous examples, and honestly there's not time to get into here, where a inferior but lower priced or ultimately free product actually beats a superior but higher priced product. And so that's something for people to be aware of if you're approaching this strategy. The second example of how to make money with open source is what I would call a hybrid product. Think of taking some part of your product, something that maybe isn't super core to your IP, to your intellectual property, and open sourcing that. Think of what the Zero folks, I would claim, very wisely did with the Open vSwitch, OVS. And from a funding standpoint, you fund it like a loss leader. You figured, well, I'm going to lose money on this anyways. Let me figure out what I can do which is interesting. Or you might actually do this, honestly, just to discourage competition. This is, I'm going to scorch the earth of what I could have made money with this so that no one else can as well. And there's actually a potential big win here, both in terms of market acceleration, trying to get this deployed as many places that you can so you can have more places to sell your upsell product as a potential. For marketing, for thought leadership, there's a lot of potential value here. The cost, as I said, really is this scorch the earth mentality. You're saying the thing that I'm going to open source here, it's going to be pretty hard for somebody to make money off of it. Imagine as a thought experiment, somebody trying to sell a KVM-based vSwitch right now that costs money. And just the hypothetical thought experiment there is, imagine I could tell you I had a switch that would go 10 times faster than OVS. Would you pay for that? I think most people would honestly have to think about that. Now, I think the OVS team is safe. I don't think it's actually physically possible to go 10 times faster than OVS. But even the fact that people have to think about it means that it's pretty hard to make money in that space now. So something to think about. On the other hand, this is a great strategy if you're a startup, but it's much harder to do for a well-developed company where you're actually potentially burning your own revenue source. So another way of looking at this. Obviously, the third extreme here is to go full Monty into open source, very much kind of like what Red Hat does. And so the idea is that 100% of your shipping product is open source. And obviously these are just different points in the balance. There's lots of different extremes here. And the idea here is that the revenue you get as a company is actually from support fees, with the idea that support is in theory optional. But of course the lie here is support's really never optional. If someone's going to deploy something in production, they need support. That's always going to be the case. And the only time you don't deploy something in production, it's the trial. And most companies will give free trials anyway, so are you actually losing money out of this? Particularly, customers really care about total cost of ownership. And most companies will break down, particularly software, in terms of an initial product purchase cost, along with a renewing support cost. And if the total cost of ownership is the same, but you jiggle between the support cost and the total product cost and whatnot, customers don't typically care so much. Some do, but having the protection of having it open source, having the ability to say, you're not locked into us, which even though having open source software is no credential against being a vendor lock-in, there's actually value here, and this is how companies like Red Hat, I could go through a bunch of others, but there are a bunch of companies that do make money in this space doing things like this. And there's actually a direct corollary out of economics theory that says that in an actually efficient market, the prices of a product actually approach the marginal cost, which is, after you've sold it to 1,000 people, what is the cost to sell it to that 1,000th and first person? That marginal cost, that delta there, that's the actual efficient value cost. And so what is that cost in software? That is the cost of support. And so there's actually economic theory behind this being the fair market value for software, which I like looking at things that way. Enough about that. Let's get into the fun legal stuff. You guys are killing me here. So, very brief overview of some of the legal bits of open source. Maybe I should start from the bottom up. I am not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. You should not construe this as legal advice. If you are thinking of doing stuff with open source, particularly if it's of value to your company, you should consult an actual real lawyer. That said, I will be covering very briefly the difference between licenses versus copyrights versus patents. Some of the issues around license conflict and what people have called code contamination or viral licensing. and some of my personal thoughts on which licenses make sense to use. And note this is actually a very few slides on an increasingly complex topic. I probably could have given an entire talk on all of this, but I think you guys would have been much broader than you are right now, so please bear with me. So in terms of licenses, copyright, and patent, license is the terms of who can use the product and how. Most of you have probably heard of GPL, Apache, BSD, Eclipse. They are actually not the same. They all have very different terms of use, things that you're allowed to do, things that you're not allowed to do, things that when you redistribute them that you have to do, that you're actually obligated to do. And there's actually really important differences between them. And that all is completely different from this other thing called copyright. Copyright is any time that you create something, whether it's a story, a song, a design somewhere, you own the copyright, and you actually don't have to, at least in the US, caveat, I'm not a lawyer, and particularly not an international lawyer, you own the copyright to that by default. Now, that's kind of cool that you kind of get a copyright just for writing code, but note that a lot of open source projects, and it's actually honestly kind of a best practice in a lot of ways, ask you to assign the copyright to them so that you waive those rights. And so you have to understand, do you care about those rights if you're going to contribute code? Is that something that's going to hold you back? What are those rights exactly? That's something for you to be aware of. And completely different from these things are intellectual property protected by patents. Most, but critically not all, open source licenses grant corresponding patent use, which is if I submit code to you where my code happens to have patent encumbrance, meaning that my company has patents that are involved in this code, what the license that I'm submitting it under actually really matters, whether you have rights to use that code. Does the patent actually transfer the patent rights? And that's something really important to understand about what is the license, what's being contributed, and these types of things. And there's all sorts of messiness that can get screwed up here if everybody's not on the same page as to what's being transferred and what the actual acceptance and licenses are. So one can imagine this gets very messy very quickly, particularly in commercial products. Once a lot of money gets on the line, a lot of lawyers get involved, and then you get these multi-year lawsuits that come down to a couple lines of code. So note that every open source project can have a different license. So if you're building up a commercial product out of a bunch of different open source licenses, it's actually possible that some of the terms of use actually conflict with each other. Couple useful pointers for this. GNU.org actually has a bunch of very useful sites, pages to work through this, particularly the frequently asked questions. They have a long list of compatible with GPL licenses, and they describe why a particular license is compatible versus not. Just to put the appropriate concern in your mind, it is absolutely possible for your closed source, proprietary, really important to your company code to become infected by an open source license. Particularly with something like GPL, the issue is around the loose definition of derived work. And there has been legal case law that says, well, once you link your proprietary code with the GPL code, maybe it is derived work. And I recommend you guys checking out the MySQL case where they actually had to open source a lot of their proprietary stuff because the legal decision was that was actually important. And for people who actually do programming, this is actually scary. The courts seem to think that the difference between static and dynamic linking might matter. But they're not quite sure yet, so let's keep an eye on this. So, quick thoughts on licenses. The most common licenses that you will run into, at least in the open source world, I claim, are GPL and Apache. So I just want to do a very quick diff against them. GPL is by far the most common, particularly version 2. Yes, licenses also have versions. They go through updates. That's also another scary process. It actually guarantees this very cool thing that all changes, in order to use the code and to distribute it to other people, all changes that you make to the code have to themselves be public and under the GPL license. This is where that term viral license comes in, because it can actually affect changes, and the change is also inherent. You can almost think of it like the legal equivalent of object inheritance. And so that's actually pretty cool because it actually has this very nice property for, which is how Richard Stallman and the gang set this up. It protects against this kind of scary thing from a commercial concept, which is the idea of a fork and close, which is I'm going to take the code that you provided, thank you very much, and I'm going to close it. And I'm going to do my own changes, and I'm going to make money off of what you did that you can't benefit from. And so GPL actually protects against this, and that's actually kind of nice. But it does so at the cost of this viral licensing concern. If you use GPL code in your commercial products, you have to be very careful about how you use it and in what context, because you actually could be considered derived work. Now, and the issue there is that the concept of what is derived and what is not is actually A, not well described in the version 2 of the license, which is most common, and B, is being played out in the courts, which is even scarier from a technical perspective. Now, that's one end of the open source licensing spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is the Apache license, Apache 2.0. It is the least common open source license. It has almost no requirements on the code. You can do almost anything you want with it. I believe the only requirement is you have to maintain the existing copyrights, which that's pretty easy. Someone can check that. The details are almost irrelevant for this discussion. But critically, there's no viral licensing concern. You can link that with any of your commercial code without problem. But there's also no protection against a fork and close. So if you publish really good, really useful open source code under the Apache license, your competitor might take it, add some useful changes, and never be forced to give them back to the community. And depending on who you are, that could be really important or could be completely irrelevant. And so, think of those as two extremes. There are licenses that are intended for roughly the middle ground, and this is clearly a nonlinear space, so excuse my term of the middle ground here. For what it's worth, I end up using the Eclipse public license for a lot of my projects simply because it's a lot like GPL, but the definition of derived work is actually very well scoped. But each of you, if you're going to move into open source, if you're going to think about pushing something to open source, is going to have to come to your own conclusions and frankly talk to your own lawyers about this. So, now that we're done with the fun stuff, I'm just going to briefly hit on a couple more points, and then I'll let you guys give me the long-earned roasting that I think I deserve. So, what are fun open source projects in SDN that you should know about? I'm very partial to Floodlight. This is me maliciously putting up my own projects up on the slide. But there's actually a bunch of other very cool projects just in the SDN controller space that honestly, I think last time I counted there were north of 20 open source controller projects that I'm even trying to track. Open Daylight's a big one. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of that. ONOS is here. That's big. POX is historically big. What was the dragon? I don't even remember anymore. Ryu, thank you. That's important. Apologies to the Ryu folks. On the virtual switch side, OVS is huge. We have our Indigo. There's also the flowforwarding.org folks.
And there's Logopus.
Yes, and Logopus. Yeah. Dan, there's going to be a long list of this stuff that I don't have time to get through. But
It's on our website.
all right. Very important then. I don't know of many open source hardware switch projects. So I've only listed my own. If people know of other ones, let me know. I can update the slide. But this is why I like Open Network Linux, if I put a little plug in. I think it fulfills a very important point in this ecosystem. And
Is it part of OCP or independent of OCP?
I'm really glad you asked, because as of 3 weeks ago, and we haven't made a formal press announcement of this, OCP has finally accepted it. So it is actually part of OCP. So I don't know if anybody tracks the Open Compute project, but after about 14 months of effort on my side, it has now formally been accepted to the Open Compute project. So that's how I spend some of my time. How to get started. This is kind of maternally annoying advice, so apologies, but just kind of every open source project has its own community. It has its own sets of momentum and egos and personalities and needs. And if you're interested in joining an open source community and contributing to it, it's actually probably worth your time to figure out, what are a little bit of the pathologies and the pros and cons of this community, and how does it make sense for you to fit into it. That said, a lot of communities actually work really hard to accept new new people. And so don't feel daunted by this statement. But no, not necessarily that all communities pride themselves on this. And if you happen to find one that is maybe a bit grumpier or looking for a higher level of aptitude than what you thought you had or something like that, know that not all open source is like that. And in general, ask. A lot of communities will have frequently asked questions. They'll have code commenting guides. They'll have a lot of material for getting started with folks. As another point, forking code, at least in my mind, is a drastic step. So a typical situation where it would be okay to fork code is if you wanted to make a fairly structural patch to someone's code and they said, I think I see where you're going here, but I disagree with what you want to do. And you say, well, I really want to do it anyways. And so if you really can't come to an agreement there, that's a reasonable point to fork code. And one of my favorite examples is, are people aware of Subversion, SVN? So the history there is that style of argument happened twice where the mainline Subversion folks continued on. The fork, I forget the name, it had some temporary name, became so popular and so useful, the mainline Subversion folks said, okay, our bad. Are you willing to let us call your fork Subversion and we'll kind of forget the mainline? And the forked people said, sure. And so that's kind of like the right thing happening, and that happened twice in the history of Subversion. I hope that's true. I've been telling that story for years. But that's definitely kind of the right thing from an open source perspective. Forking code without talking to people, without at least trying to make an attempt to keep all the code in one place is, I would claim, suboptimal. Just something to think about. So, and last, I apologize, this is my own snippiness, but if you'll see me on mailing list, quite often I'll sign something that says feedback is fine, but patches are preferred. I'm not generally trying to be passive aggressive, sometimes I use it this way, but it's very much saying, yes, I see what you're saying, but it probably requires some work, and if you really care about it, the way to show you really care about it is to write the code. And it's something to think about, because I think it actually captures a lot of what's built into open source, which is it's a little bit of a DIY mentality. If something's important to you, yeah, sure, ask if other people are working on it, but do consider writing the code yourself. And that I think is kind of the important part of the ethos. And so on that, I will kind of summarize quickly saying, I gave you my opinions, and they just are my opinions on why I do think that open source beats open standards, and why I do think it is the right direction for the ONF. And given this, I tried to provide a bit of a tutorial for what this might mean for folks in terms of where you might want to take your skills personally, what this might mean for you commercially, legally, and maybe even how to get started. And kind of as a parting thought, I will share with you something that's actually been very rewarding for me in my career was, I'll even pull it out here. My Flowvisor project got so popular that somebody that I don't know actually made a combination Flowvisor bottle opener / USB stick, which it just makes me happy every time I see it. And so that's one of the coolest things that's happened to me in my career. I've been working in networking for longer than the few number of gray hairs that I have. And I throw this out here mostly as, it can actually be extremely rewarding, and I do recommend trying it. So on that note, Asbestos underwear's on. I will take questions, and thank you very much. Mr. Pitt.
Thank you, Rob. I have heard that a number of open source communities are generally hostile, and many are particularly hostile to women. How do we avoid that in anything we undertake?
Let me separate those 2 points, because I think they are different. For better or for worse, I hate to throw out medical terms that I frankly don't understand in detail, but Aspergers is a thing in our industry. And poor communication skills, whether it's a result of Aspergers or just staring at a console for too long, can often be mistaken for hostility. The other side of that is people who think that they don't have time to spend on you comes across as hostility, and I do think that's unfortunate. That's the first part of that question. The second part of that, and I'm trying to be careful because my wife is actually a sociologist who teaches this stuff, so I feel like I should know it better and I should have a better prepared answer for you. I think honestly the best thing we can do is just encourage more people to be involved. More people, and obviously more women. But I think the more people we can have involved, the more socialized everyone gets, the more, frankly, normalized everyone gets, and then the more welcoming the community becomes. And I think getting more women involved just becomes a natural byproduct of that. Now that said, the latest stat I saw was that the ratio of men to women was 3 to 1. That means we've got some work to do. That's definitely the case. But unfortunately, I don't think there's anything unique to open source that isn't also equally applicable to the tech world in general. Someone's got to say something mean, and it's not going to be Inder. You're a very nice man. I mean nothing insulting.
I have not seen one standards body that has committed to doing open source so far, and this seems to be the first one. So I'm sure, one organization can be good at one thing or the other to be good at both. What challenges do you see and what advice do you give for ONF to be really successful in taking this on and not alienating the people who are good at building consensus and not alienating the people who are good at writing code? How do you bring those both communities together?
Technical question. Did everybody hear what Inder said, or do you want me to repeat it?
Please.
Okay. So Inder asked what might be the million-dollar question of the day, which is he has not seen a body which is an open standards body that is also good at open source. And what advice do I have that might help the ONF with this transition? Is that a fair approximation? Wow, I should have had some more sleep last night to answer that question. No, somewhat seriously. There are definitely bodies that are good at open source. There are bodies that are good at standards. I have, to Inder's point, never seen one that's good at both. And maybe even harder, I've never seen one do the transition. That said, I think people have seen me since the beginning of the ONF. I think I know a lot of people here. There's a lot of familiar faces going around. And I think there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of good intent, and there's a lot of smart people here. So I don't think that's an impossible journey. I do think that there is going to be a lot of rethinking, potentially talking to your individual companies and considering potentially even some restaffing. I'm not saying that the people here can't be involved in open source, but you may decide that's not what you want your thing to be. And so, I mean, that's a decision for each of you to come to individually and each of your companies to come to individually, because the type of people you're willing to send to a standards organization potentially halfway around the world, because I know some of you are here from halfway around the world, are different people than the programmers you might be willing to send to halfway around the world. And there's a different cost associated with that. And frankly, I think that the ONF is going to have to go through some bumps to do that transition. But I think the good news is that there's a lot of good intent. There's certainly a lot of support for the board, and we'll have to figure out that process as we go. I got a smile from him. Sir over there.
Andy Dallas.
Oh, Andy, I'm sorry.
That's okay. If open source becomes the new standard, how do you avoid problems like heartbleed, and other problems that come from inadequately used code?
So let me repeat the question. If open source becomes the new standard, how do you avoid problems like heartbleed or other indelicate uses of code? I didn't hear the last part of it.
No, inadequately reviewed.
Inadequately reviewed code. I don't know that standards bodies could ever solve that problem. And I would claim that open source eventually solved that problem, which is to say, because the code was open, someone eventually found it. Now, I will assert that there is closed source code that they have horrible vulnerabilities that no one knows about, or worse, only the wrong people know about right now. And I am this is back into my philosophy, and you guys can take it for what it's worth. My background, long before what Rick called out here, I was actually a network security admin at the University of Maryland. That's why I paid to get my way through college. And I am a long-standing, very firm believer in a security policy that's known as full disclosure, which is if you find a bug, the responsible thing to do is to first contact the maintainers, tell them about the bug, try to convince them this is a real bug, and then together with the maintainer, convince the entire world that the bug exists. And that is the right and only way to handle security problems, independent of whether it's open source or not. Now, it's much easier to find bugs if they're open source, particularly if you have all sorts of people doing really interesting things like static analysis who are looking to make a name for themselves. There's actually a lot more people looking at open source code. Now, you could say, well, that means there's a lot more attackers looking at open source code, and that's true. But there's also a lot more good guys, and it depends on your relative view of the ratio of good guys to bad guys in the world, but I will personally take that bet. And you might call me optimistic, but I think that's a safe one. Oh, I've got some good questions here. We'll go in the middle and come back. Sorry, I don't know you, ma'am. Please.
So the examples that you gave for open source, successful open source are de facto standards packages that became de facto the one and only de facto standards. And at the beginning there were a few types of TCP/IP, etc., that didn't interoperate at the beginning. So if I look at today's situation, you gave an example of SDN controllers. Now, if I have I want to write an application on top of an SDN controller, then I look at this variety, writing an application becomes difficult because each of them has a different interface and there is no interoperability here. So how to suggest to solve that if we don't have a de facto standard SDN controller or SDN agent?
I'm first going to try to summarize your question. So I don't know if I'll get all of that, but you nod to me if I got it close enough, which is if we have open source and we don't have a standards body running things first, how do we solve things like the northbound API that a lot of people would like to have? Which, it makes, if I'm a SDN application writer, I don't want to have to necessarily pick ONOS versus Ryu versus something else. I would like to write for an abstracted API and not have to pick a controller to write for. And open source actually seems to exacerbate that problem. Is that a fair summary of your question? So I would point to, it sounds like a crazy example, but bear with me. Who plays Angry Birds? Everybody knows Angry Birds, right? Who believes that Angry Birds right now runs on the mobile computing device that you have in your pocket? Everybody raise your hand. Come on, everybody raise your hand. This is true. Everybody knows that Angry Birds runs on frickin' everything. What is the northbound API for smartphones? It doesn't exist. And so what happens is, well, the fourth and fifth manufacturers would disagree with that claim, but what happens is once you have a bunch of APIs exposed to you, it's actually very easy for a software manufacturer, the makers of Angry Bird by example, can actually create their own application-specific abstraction. Once you know what the sharp pieces are, and you can look at them and actually understand them in detail, which, okay, that's an open API problem, which is different from open source, but they're highly correlated. I guarantee you, I don't work at the Angry Birds company, I even forget what it is. I guarantee you that they have an abstraction layer that they have built which fits their purpose, that then they have drivers for iPhone, for various versions of Android, for the Windows phone, for the Nokia phones, for, God help me, what is it, the Palm Pilots and everything else. And my claim is that is a solved problem from a software standpoint. Well, but it's extra work that is never going to change. Can you imagine trying to get Linus Torvalds, God, I'm tired, wow. Bill Gates and Steve Jobs from Apple all in a room and say, you guys come up with the standard, work it out? It's not going to happen. And to think that all of the members of the ONF could do the same thing across SDN controllers is still a relatively unfounded space. I mean, I'll be very happy when it does. I mean, I program these applications. I'd love for that API to exist. But my claim is that it is not required to make progress, and we have a lot of very good data points that show we actually have very vibrant, financially viable ecosystems on top without those APIs. So I apologize if it sounds like I'm making light of your question. I really don't. It's actually it's a really important question. It's just one that I guess I have a bit of a soapbox on, and I apologize for that. One more question? Sure. Jean wants to say something pointed. I would appreciate it, because I said ridiculous things. You guys are being too nice.
So for me, one of the downsides is top-down open source versus bottom-up open source. There's needs there. But principle of open source from the ONF, there is a tab application, there is a driver composition. And when you look at the activity around this project, this is pretty dismal. There is no community building around those projects. And so, open source is difficult in that sense. Some projects were able to have more top-down approach and create community like OBS. If you look at Linux, that was more top-down aspect. And so, it's not easy. Very often, when you say ONF should just do open source, I say danger there, because you never run the risk of creating some open source software that nobody uses.
I think that I 100% agree with your concern about top-down open source.
Repeat the question first.
Apologies. Tell me if I'm paraphrasing correctly. So I think Jean and I have both have had historical concerns about top-down directive in general from the ONF. Power is effectively derived by the board. We're all supposed to do roughly what the board tells us. But we're kind of volunteers. And depending on our company's internal incentive structure, maybe it makes sense to get people to do stuff, maybe it doesn't. Personally, Jean has run into this in a bad way in the extensibility working group, trying to get people to actually implement output flow extensions, as crazy as that sounds. When I was involved in the architecture working group, just wanted people to read the draft. And it was actually hard to get people to do kind of this top-down work. And I guess maybe this gets back to almost a better way of answering Inder's earlier question, which is how do we actually motivate bottom-up, more traditional grassroots open source work where people find things that they are personally passionate about and find ways to enable them to be successful in doing so. And the reason why I brought up this slide was I think there's some interesting open source projects in here. There's a bunch of things that have been useful to the community, or at least people have told me, and almost all of these things are bottom up. And it's true that the ONF did not sponsor any of these, but at least, in my mind, the real role that at least the ONF board can play with our membership dues, which is a non-trivial chunk of change, is to actually A, sponsor events like this where people can figure out how to do bottom-up community support, but B, figure out, and this is actually really the hard thing, where the cracks are, where the really things aren't all that interesting. So everybody ever seen it? There aren't a really lot of good word processor open source implementations because word processors are just not that fun to write. Like if you want to write like an editor or or like a video game, there's a lot of those. But there aren't a lot of word processors. So, and I think there is a role for top-down funding of things that are not a lot of fun to write, maybe more testing, maybe infrastructure tools, things like that, that maybe the bottom-up effort doesn't take care of. But I think to your kind of implicit question, Jean, I think absolutely the ONF really needs to focus on the bottom-up and figure out how to encourage that, because my hope is that's the vast majority of where code comes from, because that's ultimately how most open source works. Is that a sufficient answer to your question, Jean? I'm getting the nod. Okay. Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
We have to build community. You can't just put code in a GitHub repository and expect it to attract.
Yes.
A lot of development.
And top-down does not necessarily build community. It's really good for running an engineering team where you pay all the people, but it's really bad for managing volunteers. And on that point, thank you everybody for your time. My asbestos underwear is roughly undented. I'll try better next time, but thank you.